Took me 13 years to find another 200 incher, but this season I've got one, possibly two to go after.
His feeding pattern, his bedding pattern, and his mating pattern. Mm-hmm. And they're going to be different depending on what his needs are.
Right.
In your opinion, does one of those stand out as kind of the most important? So when you talk about a buck and his feeding pattern, his bedding pattern, and then also rutting, in your mind as a mature deer hunter, is one of those easiest to capitalize on? Is one of those more important to you, knowing about a deer, than another?
Well, I think what I like to capitalize on is the survival pattern of a big buck, because survival trumps everything. It trumps food, it trumps even breeding. Now, we're talking mature bucks here. If you're talking 3-year-olds and even some 4-year-olds, you know, a lot of times they'll get in trouble with a hot doe. But when you start talking 5, 6-year-old bucks, 7-year-old bucks, survival trumps everything. And so what I want to know is where does he go when the heat's on? When the pressure is highest, you know, during gun season, after gun season's been open a few days, right after gun season, where does that buck go to survive? And he's got a spot, because you know, I tell people in my seminars and whenever I'm doing things, you know, like consulting or just talking one-on-one, that I feel every mature buck alive today has a sanctuary. Because if he did not have a sanctuary, he would have never made it to be a mature buck. He'd have got killed. So, you know, when I set out to hunt a specific buck, I'm looking to find that buck's sanctuary. And, you know, I'm primarily using trail cameras to do it. And once I find his sanctuary, then I've got a chance to kill him. I think a big mistake a lot of guys make is they're hunting sign that's left behind by that buck. And sign's great, but a lot of that sign's made at night. What I want to know is, where's that buck at when the sun's up?
Mm-hmm. So how do you identify that sanctuary?
Well, it's just it's a slow process. A lot of times it's a you know, process of elimination. You're looking at areas within that buck's range, and you can kind of mark off the ones that have a lot of hunting pressure and such. You're just looking for a little nook or cranny where that buck can spend his daylight hours, and a lot of times it's not a very big spot. It's, you know, maybe a small thicket behind an old farmer's pasture where he hardly goes, or something like that, a drainage ditch out in the middle of wide open ag fields. Just little out of the way places. I'm looking, you know, I think like the big buck does, I want to stay away from all the other hunters. So where does that buck go to stay away from all the other hunters? And those are the kind of places I start looking. I place my trail cameras there and put the pieces together that way.
How do you think a buck finds that place? Do you think it's by chance that he just learns that?
Yeah.
When he goes there, he doesn't smell human? I mean, how do you think he finds that?
I think it. I don't think when bucks are young, I don't think there's some young bucks that are smarter than others, and some of them just learn to go here or there and stay safe. I think they kind of luck into it when they're young. They find that spot where they're not being disturbed, and they remember it. They remember from past seasons. And you know, once you bump a buck twice from the same spot, that's no longer a sanctuary. He's looking for someplace else. Sometimes you can get away with it the one time, but the second time it's over. He's finding a new spot to lay his head when the sun comes up.
Gotcha. So let's talk about, okay, hunting that sanctuary. Mm-hmm. Are you ever hunting near the sanctuary? Or is that where you're relying on your food patterns? Like, once you have that identified, how are you moving in on that?
Well, first of all, I would rather hunt the beds than the food anytime. I want to be right where that buck is spending his daylight hours. So I'm hunting right on the edge of the bedding cover of the sanctuary. I don't pay a whole lot of attention to feeding patterns, except some during the early season and during the late season for sure. But, you know, I just use the trail cameras to tell me where he's at specific times of the year. Like, a lot of bucks will have a spot where they spend the early season, and a totally different spot where they're at during the rut or the late season. And I just use past trail camera history to figure those spots out. And then I like to hunt the downwind edges of those bedding sanctuaries.
And do you wait on any kind of specific intel that tells you, okay, this buck's starting to show up in daylight, or the rut's picking up, or is it based on prior year's knowledge? Like, how are you're going in, you're going to hunt the downwind side of that sanctuary, but something's telling you, okay, it's time. What is that?
Well, first of all, I get all my stands ready in the spring, before green up in the spring. And then I do not go back to that stand till the day I hunt it. And what I'm doing is I'm using past intel from my trail cameras from previous years. When was that buck there last year? Because I've seen it time after time. A big buck shows up at the same spot at the same time year after year. And by keeping good records of my trail camera photos and such, a good database of those photos, I can refer back and I can know when I need to be at a certain location.
Gotcha. And so, is that looking back and seeing when he was there in daylight? I mean, because we all get nighttime pictures of bucks,
right?
Even on the edge of their sanctuary or their bedding area. Whenever you decide to call that space, we'll get nighttime pictures, and we might only get 5 pictures of a buck in the nighttime from November 1st to the 15th.
Yep.
Is that reason enough to decide to go in and hunt that deer, or is there more knowledge that needs to be gained?
Well, that's a good starting point, the time of the year, but also, like say I've got a buck that I know he shows up at a certain location about mid-October every year. Well, I know I can't go in there before mid-October. All I'm going to do is ruin my site and burn out that stand. So I wait for mid-October, but then I wait for the weather pattern as well. You get that cold front comes through, and okay, it's mid-October, the buck should be there, and now we got a cold front that's going to get him on his feet a little bit earlier than he would normally rise. So, that's a good time to go in and get it done.
Understood. Say you're kind of through a lot of your career, you have been the average guy. And, the field that I used to come from, which was industrial and commercial construction, a very limited vacation time. How should a guy like that go about deciding when he hunts? Should it be based off of prior year's knowledge if there's a specific deer? If you were in a situation where you had a limited amount of time to hunt, say 1 week, how would you go about picking those days? Would it be weather-based? Would it be, moon-based? I mean, how, in your past experience, what advice would you offer to guys?
Well, I've never been one to pay much attention to the moon. I'm not saying it don't work. It's just I want to go hunting every minute I can, and I don't want to look at some moon chart and say, well, this is a bad day, I think I'll just stay home. Yeah. I just go every chance I can. But throughout my career as a deer hunter, which spans over 40 years now, if I had to narrow it down to 1 week, year after year, it would be November 5th through the 12th. There's more Boone and Crockett bucks killed on the 7th and 8th than any other dates. And the 7th and 8th of November, those does aren't quite in heat yet, for the most part. And the bucks, their desire to breed is just building up to a fever pitch day after day after day. And by the 7th and 8th of November, they can't hardly stand it anymore. They're out running around looking for does. And the 7th and 8th is a good time to kill a lot of them. So between November 5th and the 12th is when you're going to see a lot of bucks on their feet and active.
So say a guy has limited time. He's got a specific buck that he's after. I've been hunting him 3 years. Should I wait until the rut? If there's signs that tell me that that deer is living on my property, should I start going? Should I maybe go after him a little earlier when he's not vulnerable to kind of start cruising a little bit more?
Yeah, if a buck's active in daylight, it doesn't matter if it's the first week of the season or the last week of the season or the peak of the rut. Yeah. If you know that he's active in daylight and you know where he's bedding and where he's feeding, I'd be on him if it was the first day of the season or the last. I wouldn't wait for the rut.
Gotcha. How do you go about your hunts, like as far as preserving, so that way you're not ruining a property the first time you go in the hunt? Like, what measures are you taking when you're going in? You said all your stands are hung, so I'm guessing you're almost never going in, stand on back, that kind of thing.
Right.
What do you think that's kind of the secret to preserving a property and not overly influencing it from the start?
Well, that question, the answer to that question is based primarily on the type of cover you're hunting. If you're in a big woods area, such as what you're familiar with, probably hanging a stand during the season is not that bad of an idea. Yeah. But I'm hunting a lot of small woodlots and small narrow travel corridors where you got to be really careful to keep from bumping those deer. So I want my stands all in place before season ever opens. Actually, in the spring, before things green up, I want all my stands in place. and then I just wait for the time to be right based on a whole list of previous intelligence that I've gathered on that deer. When the time's right, I'm going into a stand that's pre-hung. I've never been there before during hunting season, so I've not left scent at that location for months, and slip in and get it done. I'm always watching the wind though. I mean, entrance, the access route to a stand, and wind direction as you're hunting that stand are very key. If they're wrong, you can burn out a stand the first 30 minutes you're sitting in it.
Gotcha. Do you think, in your experience, how many of your big deer have been killed on first to third sits, let's say?
Just about all of them. Yeah. I mean, a good portion, and that comes down to the property you're hunting again. If you're hunting a large property with limited pressure, one with food plots and sanctuary, and it's been managed strictly for big bucks, you can get away with a whole lot more. Yeah. And on situations like that, you can hunt a stand multiple times in a season and still expect to kill a mature buck there. But when you go out and hunt in the real world, and you got to deal with other hunters and all the pressures of, farmers being out, small game hunters, and the list just goes on, then you don't get too many cracks at a mature buck that lives under those conditions. He picks up on what you're doing a lot faster than you pick up on what he's doing. So, and that's where trail cameras are really valuable, because that trail camera's out there 24 hours a day, watching when you're at home or whatever. Those trail cameras are your eyes on multiple locations 24 hours a day. So,
any advice for running cameras to kind of, do you try to stay scent free, kind of under the radar when you're running your cameras? I mean, there's a lot of guys who take the exact opposite approach, which is, I'm not going to hide it at all. I'm going to stay as kind of pretend like I'm the farmer and just kind of putt in and check my camera and get back in the truck. I mean, what is your theology on trail cameras and how to approach them?
Well, the approach I take with trail cameras is I don't go scent free and sneaking in. I'll hop on my four-wheeler a lot of times and ride right up to the camera. I don't have my cameras right where I have my tree stands. I want to stay back away from that secure cover, because I don't want to take any chances of busting that buck or spooking him away. Once I know where he's bedding, I want him to continue to bed there, because that's the only way I'm going to have a chance to kill him. So I'll go out on the edges around that location and put my trail cameras there, and then just drive right up on a four-wheeler or walk right up. I will wait and do it most of it in the middle of the day, so a period of time where there's the least amount of deer activity. But that's about the extent of it.
Yeah. I would say at least a third of whitetail deer hunters with Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the Appalachian states, northern states, deal with swirling winds really bad. So everybody talks about, and this is one of the things I struggled with growing up, was like, everybody on TV is telling me about hunt the wind, hunt the wind. I go try to hunt the wind, and it's like, I don't know what the heck to do. Do you have any advice for guys that hunt in conditions that don't really allow a consistent wind?
Well, for one thing, you got to get out of the bottoms, and you get up as high as you can on the ridges. The saddles are ridges. A lot of times the reason the bucks are bedded where they are is because the wind currents are to their advantage. But you just got to learn how the wind currents traverse through your hunting property. There's times you'll hang a stand and you think the wind's out of the south. When you get to that stand, it's actually out of the north, because that wind is swirling, or it's eddying. It's hitting a tree line and coming back down, and up high, it is out of the south, but down low, it's out of the north. Yeah. So you just got experience, really, just over time at specific locations, not experience overall. It's specific experience at a specific location. You just got to learn how the wind traverses your hunting property.
Well, that's what I wonder sometimes too. If in the big woods there's such vast places that your mind tends to want to try all these different places, and sometimes I wonder if you'd be better off taking that 100 acres that there's good, there's good terrain features in, and truly focusing on it and learning it.
Yeah, I agree. There's those magical spots that'll produce year after year after year once you figure them out. Yeah. And you know, the hardest mature buck to kill is your first one.
Yeah.
The second one gets a little bit easier, next one a little bit easier, and the following one a little bit easier. And by the time you've killed, you know, 8 or 10 of them, it's like you can do it year after year then. Yeah. But it's really hard to put your finger on and explain to somebody. It takes experience, but part of that experience is you're gathering information on your specific hunting area that can be used in future seasons. You're fine-tuning what you need to do there. You know, the exact tree you need to be in, the exact wind direction you need to be in that tree, the exact dates you need to be in that tree. And once you figure it out, then you just come back year after year and get it done. Yeah. And then you also, over time, you build more and more of those situations. So now you don't just have a couple of go-to stands. You got 6 or 8 or 10 or 12, you know, specific trees that you know the recipe for that tree. You know the time, you know the wind direction, you know everything that's needed at that tree. And when you put all those things together, then, you know, consistent success becomes a real possibility.
Understood. What would you say is your favorite time of year to hunt? If there's a week, let's say, or even just a period of the season.
You know, that's a tough question. What's my favorite time of the season to hunt? I like them all, really. I've killed mature bucks in the early season, during the rut, and the late season. And you know, I think for killing true giants, the late season's it. There's absolutely no doubt about it in my mind that you get really brutal cold conditions and a prime food source December and January, and then you get a cold front. I'm talking really cold. I'm talking at night, you know, it's 0 or below, single digits during the day. When those conditions are present, every mature buck is going to be on his feet. There's no such thing as a nocturnal buck under them conditions. And then the thing about it is you know exactly where he's going every afternoon and when he's going there. Every afternoon he's headed for that prime food source. And it makes hunting them a whole lot easier. It's just the brutal conditions you got to endure to be out there at that time is the hardest part of it. But there's no better time to kill a big mature buck on purpose than the late season.
Favorite food source to be over during those times?
Soybeans, hands down. Soybeans are my favorite food plot. They're great early, they're great during the rut, but man, the late season, man, they really shine. There is nothing that compares to soybeans when the temperature gets down around 0.
Understood. Do you think that a lot of people talk about cold fronts, and one of the things that came up a lot in the early discussions that we've had with people was cold fronts throughout the season. Mm-hmm. Do you think that an October cold front I guess my question is, during those early season cold fronts where the temperature is really not dropping to a place where it affects the deer, mm-hmm. it might make them feel a little more excited, I guess you'd say. Mm-hmm. Or do you capitalize at all on October cold fronts?
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't really matter when that cold front hits. If the temperature is, you know, 10 to 15 degrees below what it normally would be at that time of the year, the deer know it, and they're really a lot more active. So I definitely capitalize on cold fronts no matter what time of the year they happen.
What do you think Midwest wise? Where have you seen, habitat types that deer are bedding in?
That's widely varied. I've seen mature bucks bedded in wide open, you know, picked cornfields. I've seen them bedded in the thickest, nastiest brush that you can imagine. Tall bedding grasses. I really like the native prairie grasses that are 6-8 feet tall. I know I've seen individual bucks that preferred those grasses over any other type of cover, but it's more of an individual preference for different individual bucks.
Well, like some guys talk about, you know, how bucks like to bed with the wind. Mm-hmm. You know, J-hook into their bed to get that wind coming over their back to where they can see. Do you believe in that kind of stuff, or do you think that's situational?
No, absolutely. But it's situational, but I don't think a buck just waltzes into his bed and plops down. He scent checks that from downwind in the dark. Mm-hmm. Then he hooks into it, or he knows where he wants to bed before he lays down. And he doesn't approach that bed just randomly. He approaches it with a purpose. He's making sure that bed's safe for the day before he goes in.
Is that what you're setting up on when you set up on the edge of a bedding area?
Yeah, a lot of times.
Scent check?
Absolutely, a lot of times, especially in the mornings in November. You get on the downwind edge of bedding cover, and you don't even need a deer trail in front of you. Those mature bucks, and when they're on the search for does, they're moving through terrain features that funnel them down on the downwind edge of bedding cover. That's as good as it gets.
Is that your favorite type of setup outside of late season food sources?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Early rut, downwind edge of bedding cover is perfect.
Yeah. Okay, say there was a big buck that you followed the year before, followed him through season, never quite understood what he was doing. If you're going into that knowing, and obviously it's different for you now because you know your properties pretty well, and you kind of probably know what a buck's going to do. But say you're going to a client property, and they're telling you about this buck, and you're there in the off season, in early spring. What are you looking for to tell you where they need to have their cameras, where they need to set up? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, again, the most important thing when you're hunting mature bucks is you need to know where they're bedding and where they're spending their daylight hours. And until you know that, you really can't put a plan together to kill that buck. So, you know, food sources, you can plant your food plot and you can know that buck's feeding here, but where's he coming from to get here? Because if you think about it, during the course of an entire hunting season, how many daylight hours does a mature buck spend in a food plot? I bet you could count on one hand the number of hours that buck spends in a food plot in daylight during an entire hunting season. But yet every day, you know, most of his hours for an entire day are spent in the bedding cover, and that's where you got to be if you want to consistently kill him, is in that bedding cover. So, you know, if I go to a client's property, the first thing I'm doing is looking at where are we going to put the sanctuary, because a buck needs a sanctuary. He needs a reason to be bedding on that property. And I tell people all the time, think of your property as one square on a giant checkerboard with other squares. You got to do everything possible to make your square better than all the other squares around it. You got to give the deer every reason to spend his daylight hours on your square, and that means freedom of human intrusion. He needs a bed where he's safe every day of the year, not just during the fall and hunting season. That buck needs to be safe in there all winter, all spring, all summer. You know, you might have to intrude in there a couple times, you know, for a scouting mission in the winter, and then come back to put your stands up and such. But you don't want to be making regular trips into a sanctuary once you've either discovered one or you're trying to create one on your property.
So do you typically discover it and let the deer tell you where to create that kind of area you don't go into? I mean, are you typically trying to find a natural?
Yeah, I've done it both ways. If I have total control over a property and can manage it the way I want, then I'm creating a sanctuary. And it may already be a sanctuary to some degree, but I want to make it a sanctuary to the umpteenth degree, just as much as possible.
Where you decide to put those, are you kind of trying to decide where deer already naturally want to be?
Yeah, a lot of times. And the other thing you want to do is you want to move those sanctuaries away from your property edges. You don't want to create a sanctuary in the back corner of your property and then the neighbor sits there across the fence and either he shoots your deer or his scent blows into the sanctuary and ruins it. Yeah. You need to be mindful of where that sanctuary is on a property. But then on the other hand, you know, I'm always searching for sanctuaries too. I watch bucks grow up through trail camera pictures, and I want to find that buck sanctuary. I want to find where he's spending his daylight hours, and sometimes I'll go in and enhance it, you know, maybe do a little bit of hinge cutting or something to enhance that sanctuary just a little bit. Because say, for example, you got a buck that's bedding in a timber that's 50 acres. It's been recently logged, and he can bed about anywhere in there. There's treetops everywhere that he could bed under, and some terrain with ridges and such. But you can do some things to really encourage him to bed on a certain ridge, for example. And you want things to be at his advantage for the most part, but at the same time, you want to be able to capitalize on it too. Make him comfortable. And you know, the legendary Roger Rothar from Ohio years ago said that you want things almost perfect for the buck and almost wrong for you. Because if it's almost right for him, he's comfortable moving in daylight. And if it's almost wrong for you, then you know, it's to his advantage. You're walking a fine line, and if you can walk that fine line, that buck will be on his feet in daylight, and you can capitalize on it and put your tag on him.